The world's indoor track record for appearances at IdeaCity belongs to Terry Mosher. Aislinn. And he has been here just about every year doing his fabulous annual wrap-up events, except on those years when he is graduating daughters, of which he has an endless supply because we haven't seen him for a number of years.
Or the birth of grandchildren.
And the birth of grandchildren, but I'm thrilled to have you back, Terry.
Moses, listen, congratulations to you Torontonians. Well done.
Oh, that's us. Rick, Terry, Mary, and Mo. I love that.
I mean, they won't give us back the Stanley Cup, so you guys go. You keep winning. Don't give it back to the Americans. I got to show you an artifact. Look at this. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
No, I need a slide. There we go.
There we go.
It's a 2002 IdeaCity bag. That's when I first spoke here. And it's the perfect bag. The iPod wasn't even invented at the time. But there you go. It holds one perfectly. It holds a sketchbook. And it holds a couple of pencils. I can go around the world with this and send stuff back. It's fantastic. Anyway, so I've appeared here 15 times. There were a couple of years I didn't appear. So what I'm going to do is give you a very fast review of those 15 years and some of the highlights. Moses is to be congratulated for supporting cartooning because we've had some difficult years in political cartooning. Nevertheless, in 2002, George Bush was the President of the United States. Canada went shoulder to shoulder with America in Afghanistan. And in February of that year, a very interesting thing happened. February, it is the worst month, as you know, in Canada. But Bill Clinton came to Montreal. He was going to speak, benefit of a hospital. And the organizers said, Terry, would you draw a thank you cartoon, and could you be nice for a change? Well, this is how it started. Why Montreal in February, Mr. President? Why not July? You know, he could play his saxophone, appear perhaps at the famous Montreal Jazz Festival. Everybody loved this cartoon. Here he is, Bill Clinton. He has the cartoon. It's hanging on his wall in Harlem still. The Gazette put it on the front page. But the rascal in me didn't like the cartoon that much. This is the cartoon I wanted to give him. I didn't think I'd be invited back, but the call came from Moses. He said, would you come back and do the show again? I said, well, what the hell? I said, I'm going to bring my wife, because she loves this stuff, you know? Neurosurgeons talking about astrology, whatever it happens to be. So I came back. That was the year that they caught Saddam Hussein. Do you remember that, some of you? Well, here's how, so I explained then how I draw, how I work. And so I did this initial, look at the tiling in the back. For an eye for looking for setting a scene, that's very important. It indicated he was caged in. So I did a very rough sketch of him just to get the thing started. And then a more detailed sketch, but I added the tiles in the back that became caging. So there's your final sketch. If you remember, the American generals were classifying the importance of the Israeli generals with playing cards, face cards. So I tore up an ace of spades. They got the ace of spades, mounted the sketch with a computer on the card, dropped in some color. The Gazette took one look at it, and look at what they did with it. They put it right on the front page. So I explained that year the whole process of cartooning. It's not just a simple business of sitting down and... Then he invited me back again, and the next year, I thought I'm going to talk about some of my favorite cartoons. The New Yorker had just put out a wonderful book with all our cartoons they had printed at the time. And there's some just classics there. For example, this one, Two Dogs sitting at a computer. This was drawn in 1992. And one dog is saying to the other dog, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. But my all-time favorite from the New Yorker is drawn by a fellow by the name of Stan Gross, wonderful old cartoonist. And again involved dogs. Here, you have doggy heaven, you see. And all the dogs are kind of flying in with one guy talking to the St. Peter dog, if you will. Rembrandt used those techniques. You know, circling the eye into something to get it to the center. In any case, here's the clincher. What's the little dog saying to St. Peter? Is there any chance of getting my testicles back? But it's sort of it's interesting how the presentations changed with the mood of the times. The next year was very serious. It was the business of the Islamists getting very angry about cartoonists in Denmark drawing Muhammad. This is one of the drawings. And I mean, you know, hundreds of people died, churches were burned. It was really quite something. There was actually one funny cartoon there where some of the suicide belt people showed up and Muhammad saying we've run out of virgins in paradise. But the only way the cartoonist could answer this was being sort of just mocking the whole silly business of trying to... Dan Murphy, I love this one by Dan Murphy in Vancouver. A cartoonist tries to heal the hurt. What about a connect the dots, Muhammad? Suddenly, though, cartoons were dangerous. You know, you didn't want to be caught with one in your luggage. So Muhammad, that's interesting. Moses invited me back again, and there were a couple of years we did Bowser and Blue. We introduced Bowser and Blue. We did a bunch of things. We produced a stage show we'd done. We were having a lot of fun with it, and then when Obama came along, I gave a whole presentation on how cartoonists all over the world were drawing Obama. They were having a great time, and they all secretly kind of liked the guy, I think. A wonderful thing. Look at that. You know whose finger that is. In any case, I closed that show with the business of the Obamas had visited Buckingham Palace. And Michelle Obama was a newcomer to the business of protocol. What did she do? But she touched the Queen. You don't do that. You don't touch the Queen. But the Queen, trying to be gracious, touched her right back. Now, when I saw that on YouTube, I could not resist drawing the next cartoon that I didn't think would be printed. It was my most popular cartoon in 10 years, so I'm glad they printed it. And then one year I just talked about technology and how we're making the shift in cartooning. Because despite the shape of newspapers, cartooning remains as popular as ever on the internet and everywhere. So how we're making the shift, not only in terms of getting onto the internet and different things, but also how we're drawing, how we're creating wonderful graphics, strong graphics. Most of these created on the computer using wonderful computer techniques. Take a look at some of these. Wonderful thing. So it was a whole series, immigration, you know, the problems of immigration, brilliant things being created in the world. Then for a couple of years, I talked about Canadian cartooning and the wealth of Canadian cartoonists we have here, a whole bunch of them. And to drop some cartoons in there of mine, like, you remember the Miley Cyrus business? That was quite something. But at the time, Pauline Marois was the Premier of Quebec. And you know, you just add a few pounds to Miley, and you have Pauline Marois. We were spreading out as Canadians, too. We started appearing at conferences in San Francisco, American conferences. One year we had a wonderful conference, a Canadian convention, in Havana with all of the cartoonists in Cuba. A great time. So we're reaching out, talking a lot about Canada, how there was a petition abroad to change the Canadian flag to this. Come on. There we go. and how that we were all going to emigrate. Every Canadian was going to emigrate to Cuba in February. That one didn't get printed. It's interesting how it's gone back and forth, because then suddenly in 2015 you had the terrible business in Paris of the magazines, the 6 cartoonists being slaughtered at Charlie Hebdo, and there was a great reaction to that. All of the cartoonists produced different things sort of strongly. Even the world leaders showed up in Paris. Now, you've got to give Moses credit. He gave us a budget that year to bring the top people in the world into IdeaCity and talk about the business of what had happened with Charlie Hebdo. Cal from The Economist, Ann Telnis, the Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist from The Washington Post, Dan Murphy, one of the cleverest Canadians alive. He brought the house down with his presentation. Patrick Chapat of the New York Times, International New York Times. Hold that thought. We get to something else about that. So they all addressed the issue. And then the following year, what came along? There's always something happening. Donald Trump, 2016. And suddenly, I mean, you could do anything to Donald Trump, and we have continued to do so. But the odd thing is, here's the puzzle. He's so easy to cartoon, he's difficult. He's a cartoon himself. I mean, here's a wife is leaning into a cartoonist studio saying, "Stop, that Trump cartoon you came up with this morning just happened." It was also the year of Justin Trudeau coming along and going from riding his dad's car shirtless up to Ottawa. But he went from 3rd place to 1st place, got a majority. It was a phenomenal year, and he was really caught on. But then he proved that, he has feet of a little bit of clay. He went to India and came back, and it's been a bit of a slide ever since that time. Then along came Scheer. I still don't know how to draw Scheer. He's a hard guy to get a hold of. So then what do we got after that? Oh, yeah, then 2017 was nice. Moses allowed me. I celebrated my 50th year of cartooning. And we did a book, we produced it, had exhibitions, museums, shows, this, that, and the other. I gave a presentation on that here in Quebec, at IdeaCity. It was really something. I mean, from Trudeau to Trudeau in my career, when you think about it. I've met them both. There's Pierre. There's Justin getting his copy of the book. These guys pretend to like us. They have to. So, oh, I can laugh at myself. I love your work, But they never have us over to dinner. It's funny, huh? Not all of them. Look at this guy. Actually, it was a lot of fun. He has a terrific sense of humor, Jean Chrétien. Then last year, didn't it get serious again? The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette fired their cartoonist. They had been taken over by right-wing people. Friends of Donald Trump had taken over the newspaper. They didn't like him criticizing Trump too much. They fired him, and it caused national headlines. The cartoonist was interviewed on CNN. A lot of people came to his defense. Ann Telnis again, who's appeared in IdeaCity here 3 times, and she stood up, and he's landed on his feet. Here's the odd thing. The New York Times, the wonderful New York Times, offered him space to write about his experience. Nice. New York Times. But wait a minute, this year, the New York Times, International New York Times, I should say, not the New York Times, says that they're no longer going to print cartoons because of the reaction to this cartoon. Granted, it's a very strong cartoon. It's of Netanyahu. He was worried in his own country of Portugal that they wouldn't recognize Netanyahu, so he put the Star of David on it to make it represent Israel, which is a no-no in cartooning. The guy didn't know it, the cartoonist. and leading a Donald Trump. The thing is that there's a legitimate point of view from a lot of people, but he expressed it in such a way that a lot of people got upset, huge reaction. New York Times decided we're no longer going to print cartoons internationally. But the same cartoonist had drawn this a few years before. Israel, the United States, suicide bombing. I mean, clearly, it was sort of a pox on both your houses. He hated the situation. This is Antonio Tunes. This was not some kid drawing cartoons in the basement. Antonio is the top cartoonist in Portugal. You walk down the street with him in Lisbon, it's like walking down with a rock star. Everybody knows who he is. So this is not some disreputable anti-Semitic guy. This is a legitimate cartoonist who's known all over the world. So I think the New York Times really were wrong in doing this. They're catching it now. I mean, look at this great cartoon. If the New York Times responds to complaints about its stories and columns the way it responds to complaints about editorial cartoons, that's what it would look like. Patrick Chapat, who had appeared in Quebec City, caught the brunt of it. And Michael Dieter did a strong cartoon of the New York Times throwing Chapat to the lions. So the cartoonists in force have come out on this issue. Here's another one. I mean, okay, we understand that the Islamists were upset about the visual images, but, you know, suddenly being paired with the editors of the New York Times. So a great deal of reaction is still going on this front. The thing is, here's my philosophy. No person, no thing is ever perfect. We all have faults and weaknesses. Can we admit as much by laughing at ourselves or at our frailties? Well, I've appeared at IdeaCity, as I mentioned, any number of times, and I'm going to continue to next year, and I'll tell you why. I've written, we forget people. Rick was talking about history. We tend to forget great Canadians. We forget, they just kind of disappear. And I'm not going to let that happen I'm going to stand up for one Canadian who we should not, he died in 1993, so just before the internet really got started. He doesn't even have a web page, and yet he was the most, I'll say it, he was the best Canadian political cartoonist we ever produced. His name was Duncan Macpherson. He wrote cartoons for the Toronto Star from 1958 until he died in 1993. And the guy was just a legend. So next year, I'm going to come with my book, Duncan Macpherson by Terry Mosher, An Appreciation of One Canadian Cartoonist for Another. The guy, I mean, politicians were terrified of him about appearing in a Macpherson in his heyday. He was just an astonishing guy, but it wasn't just Canadian stuff. He did graphics, wonderful graphics. When man landed on the moon, Americans landed on the moon with a golf ball. I mean, just so rich. My favorite cartoon, Rick was talking about the Inuit. My favorite cartoon drawn by Duncan was 1978, and television arrived in the North, and much heraldry about that. And so Duncan drew a cartoon in the Toronto Star of a group of Inuit in the igloo laughing at the white man's news. Hilarious thing. There are no words in that, just very funny, but also the expression, the drawings there. I mean, any other cartoonist drools when they see his ability to draw. He also crossed, like Rick was talking about, Duncan crossed Canada constantly and produced books of wonderful watercolors. I mean, even that alone in the book is going to be a great, great image. That was, that was St. John's, Newfoundland there, boat builders in Lévis, Quebec. Wonderful things. In Rostov and Moscow, it's sort of a scenario at the airport where they've got a leftover used jet engine. He's a bit of a reporter, too, to clear the runway. They run but in behind, there's a little lady with a broom in case they screw up, you know? A baseball game in Cuba. Look at the beautiful drawing this guy does. He's just an I will say that he drew as well as any, never mind cartoonist, as any Canadian artist I can think of, with all respect to the Group of Seven and that sort of thing. The guy could draw beautifully. This is a baseball game in Cuba, but with political speeches beforehand. And the Red Guard soldiers playing basketball in the Forbidden City in China. Just a drawing in the island somewhere. Look at that. Look at that drawing. I mean, for anybody who draws, that is just a phenomenal piece of work. Here's the thing, though. He much glory, met the Queen and so on, but he was also, I've got to tell you, he was quite the rascal. So I'm writing this book. It's going to be a 400-page book with hundreds of cartoons, illustrations, painting, my tribute to a Canadian, a great Canadian, who should not be forgotten. So is it a date for next year?